like to start by acknowledging that, with the acknowledgement of country, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present. The first peoples of this land were the first storytellers, the first communities. Sovereignty has never been ceded. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It gives me great delight to actually be part of this festival, which was introduced so warmly and wholesomely by Leo last night. This particular panel, or this whole festival, presented by Liminal in partnership with the Wheeler Centre, and this panel in particular is supported by the Sydney Review of Books. The Liminal Festival was supported by the Victorian Government through Creative Victoria. Hello, I'm James Jang. I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books, and it's like one of the, this is a kind of dream scenario for me to be on stage with Bella Lee and Lucy Van. It's quite customary, I think, to, sort of butter each other up, as it were, but I'm going to use this occasion in introducing two people I admire not only as artists but also as people to to kind of express my gratitude to them in quite personal ways. So I hope you're prepared for the sentimentality that is about to wash over you. So immediately to my left is Bella Lee, who's the author of Argosy, Lost Lake and Theory of Colours most recently, all published by Vagabond Press. Her work, which combines text and image, has won the Victorian and New South Wales Premier's Prizes for Poetry and Australian Book Designers Association Award, as well as being a brilliant poet and, I would argue, one of the great contemporary poetry editors and curators, who's worked with Five Islands and Slow Canoe. I had the great privilege of working with Bella on a Liminal project. It was a collaboration between Liminal and Cordite Poetry Review on a collection of Asian Australian poetry, new Asian Australian poetry. And I have to say, this does not reflect very well on me, but I'm going to tell you this anecdote anyway. I thought I was a good editor, and then I sent Bella my introductory essay for editorial feedback, and I realised there's a whole different level of editorial nous and insight. So I was very humbled and edified. But I'm very.
That I'm meaner than you, James?
A little bit, yeah. Unexpected, yeah. She looks nice, but she's really vicious in her trap comments But no, it was a brilliant experience and a very, very, as I said, edifying one. And to my far left is Lucy Van, who is a poet and critic. Her collection, The Open, published by Cordite in 2021, was longlisted for the Stella Prize, shortlisted for the Mary Gilmore Award, and highly commended in the Anne Elder Award. She is an honorary fellow, is that the right at the moment?
Sorry.
Honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. Lucy's book, co-authored with Anne Maxwell, Australian Women's Historical Photography, is going to be launched August 15th, so get to that if you can. And Lucy's also, as she informed me yesterday, her manuscript, the beginning of the poem, is complete. It's just currently sitting in a drawer. And we'll see the light of day shortly. We hope. I hope, at least. And actually, Lucy was the first reviews editor I worked with or under. She commissioned me to do my first poetry review at Cordite, actually. So in some ways, she's responsible for setting me on this path. And I used to share an office with Lucy, and I have to say that experience in and of itself was kind of an education in contemporary poetry. She introduced me to poets from Melinda Bobus to Ocean Vuong. So again, very grateful to have been in contact with them. Anyway, I hope that's okay. It's, you can remonstrate with me afterwards. But we thought we'd start. One of the things I would like to use this opportunity to is to kind of present these two writers also as readers, and I suggested this, and they very kind of gratefully, very very graciously accommodated this. I thought we'd start by actually reading and looking at a poem together. So if we could pull that up on screen. It's a poem by Lisa Gorton. It's the opening poem in her collection Empirical. It was kind of slightly random, to be honest. I was in the Bailey looking for a poem that we might discuss, and this was a collection that kind of leapt out at me. Lisa is a poet that we all greatly admire. She's also a formidable critic, a Melbourne poet. And I think in terms of, you know, the kinds of themes and the evocations of the blurb for our panel, I thought that this was maybe a good fit. So would either of you like to read the poem out?
Oh my God, okay. The whole thing? Or just-
Yes,
okay.
please, yeah.
Empirical 1. A factory, the train line curving off to cross the motorway. Between them, this falling away of ground, 2 or 3 acres, where for years the council trucks brought building rubble, mounds of shattered concrete, brick shards, piping, steel mesh heaped here, where grass succeeds itself, and flowering weeds. And now I walk into the wreckage, its tricks of scale, broken horizon stone with high-head fennel, milk thistle, stark from the mounds, dandelion, the colour of barbed wire self-seeding in wind shale, in soft mortar at the level of my eye, its closed array. And it is the first place itself, grown inward to my sight, along the side of the house, in the playground where dry ground slants to the fence out of the history of their names, where these same weeds thrive, which have made for me a heraldry of my forgetting, tussock, rampant in field azure, and set me here, in its abyss, giving the bright scenes place, which is to say I have not seen it yet, a wilderness to me which is to itself single, closed in its processes, happening over and over, though not to itself, being to itself a storm, perpetually in the front of light.
Thank you. I'm just going to give everyone a few, like maybe a minute or so, just to kind of look the text over. Can we keep it on screen? Thank you. Some of the lineation, I'm very grateful actually to the We Listen to staff, because I took 2 really shoddy photographs, which they have very graciously kind of transcribed. Some of the lineation is off though. There's a line break after dandelion, I think, and over should be on the same line, if you care for such things.
Which we do.
Which...
James, is the audience going to provide some readings of this poem too?
If they desperately want to, if they want to foist some guerrilla interpretations on us, so...
I noticed something.
What did you notice?
The poem is mostly made of 2 and 1 syllable words. So there is something significant that happens when there are 3 syllables. And the final line begins with perpetually, so that's 5. So there is a kind of... I don't know, like a scene of accumulation, if I can use that phrasing, with that kind of unit of poetry, the syllable. So some of those 3-syllable words, factory, which maybe we can come back to because it's the first noun, flowering, where are they?
Motorway.
Dandelion, motorway.
Yeah.
Horizon, wilderness.
Forgetting, wilderness processes happening. So they can be, because of this syllabic arrangement, those words can be connected or across the poem. That was one of the things that I just thought of.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think for me, and maybe we can draw some of these threads together as we go, but the the use of the dash, which is both, it's a separation of parts, and yet it's also, particularly because Lisa has chosen to use the unspaced M here, it's also a connecting a bridge or a span, right? And actually, I was thinking in the previous panel when Evelyn was talking about having to fight for her use of all caps, how much poets still, I think, have to fight for particular uses of punctuation like this, because with the end dash, for instance, you come up against often house style, and house style, particularly in Australia, is the spaced N, which is a much shorter dash, and it leaves a gap, right, between. And I don't know if anyone knows if Giramondo has what their house style is. Anyway, but I can imagine that there may have been a conversation about it, and that Lisa would have said, because she uses it all throughout this book, and in her next book as well, the significance of having that closed M with that longer span and that connecting. And I think, Lucy, thinking about accumulation as this kinetic kind of force throughout the poem, I feel like the dashes are really central to that, right? Like they're doing the job of separating, but they're also driving forward. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting because it's there's a lot of dynamism in it, but it feels quite suspended too. And when you think about, I think, the syntax, it's all kind of essentially one sentence, but it's very hard to locate where the kind of focal point or finite verb is, I think. And I'm very curious about, the thing that it's interesting, to go back to the topic, the title of this panel, Visions and Revisions, the way in which certain lines perform a revision on previous lines. So I really love the line, which had made for me a heraldry of my forgetting, both for the subtlety of its internal rhyme, made for me heraldry. Heraldry being another one of those, polysyllabic words that Lucy was talking about, but also how that revises our sense of succeeds both as a kind of phenomenological thing, one image after another, and the kind of parataxic kind of syntax and structure of this poem, but also succession as a form of genealogical consolidation, which is implied by heraldry and that joke about rampant, tussock rampant, the rampant lion, but also proliferating. And this is also, this is a poem about settlement, right? It's providing a kind of allegory about settlement in some way. So I was actually really scared of talking about this poem, but now I'm like, we've got so much stuff to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. So it does feel like some kind of visioning of the landscape, but it's just this amazing thing where, through those anchors of like quite solid objects, the factory, the motorway, very particular weeds that she's identified. She's making you very intensely aware of the materiality of this space, and yet she's also simultaneously dematerializing it as she goes. Right, she's throwing in these. I think for instance, that first line. The line break, the train line curving off, and it feels like with every line break, she's kind of, moving you into some kind of infinite distance or an illusion of infinite distance. But then the next, turning it over, the line curving off to cross the motorway, right? So she brings you back. There's an intersection, there's a relation set up, and then again between them this. And then a kind of a casting off into space at the end of that line. And so, I guess that constant stability through identifiable points, but then destabilizing and dematerializing as well.
Yeah, it has an interesting sense of wreckage in a way, like that word, it's at least up here on its own in the line, like that you sort of, in a poem, there is a sort of an activity of figuration, and or some sort of assemblage of language, and then you back out, or you sort of create it, you make it, and then you wreck it, and that sort of maybe I hate this word universal, but maybe there is a sort of a fundamental aspect of this in poetry, or it's something that we can see. And it's interesting, this is the first poem of the collection, so it's kind of creating this world and then backing out of it, or it's the place that isn't a place, you know, or transposing the place, consigning it into somewhere that it doesn't exist in physical space.
It's a poem that's very aware of its own, the unavoidable, I guess, like kind of will to allegory, but also a slight suspicion of it too. And I mean, I did that very nerdy thing where I scanned this poem last night. And I was like, oh, you know.
That's cool. That's not nerdy. That's like the
you would say
coolest.
it's cool. I mean, typical. But it is interesting, you know, like there's a kind of you know, kind of very interesting relationship between agency and passivity here. Things happening over, things spinning out of control in what is otherwise quite a very finely controlled poem. But, you know, there is, you know, a use of the I, but the I, the first person, is never stressed. What is stressed is the I, which is the organ of receptivity, the you know, the organ of sight, which is a very, I think, you know, very subtle kind of way of dramatizing that sense of accumulation, but also suspicion of accumulation, a certain worry or concern about cumulativeness and its ability to just happen on its own.
And I guess the possessiveness that the I entails, right? I mean, really, so is the I only appears actually of the first person I twice, right? And one is to sort of place the speaker, because at this point we haven't had any sense of where the speaker is in relation to all of these objects, and it's a very sort of emphatic, and now, you know, it's a placement in time as well, right? And now I walk into the wreckage. But then, yeah, as you were saying before, Lucy, as well, a kind of it's a removal of the I as soon as the I is stated, because then it reverts to the I, as in the organ, the I, for most of it. And then the second I is a kind of negation, right? Yeah. It's like, which is to say, I have not seen it yet. It's an implicating the I as well in that, but it's a stepping back from any kind of ownership, I guess, of the...
Yeah, it's the first moment of rhetorical self-assertion, which is to say, kind of in a slightly throat-clearing way, but yet then there's like the self-effacement of I have not seen it yet. I mean, we could actually just talk about this poem all day. Do you have any other things you might want to say? I think maybe we might want to move it on instead of move outwards from this, maybe return to it. Could we just keep it on the screen? Yeah. Any concluding comments?
Oh, just that word factory. Yeah. I just, what is a factory? Is it a homophone? I don't know. I'm like, is there a factor, or there's sort of like this, I don't know, machine for creating facts that the poem is instantiating in some sort of way. What is, like, I don't know, that I didn't have anything that profound to say, other than I thought it was that my eye keeps returning to it. In what way is this poem producing, you know, which I guess is the purpose of a factory?
Yeah. Well, the kind of inevitability of some sort of product and a certain ambivalence about that. A poem as a factory, which is also a wreckage. I mean, I had this slightly, I mean, this is probably from staring at the poem too long, but the idea of brought building rubble, which is obviously the rubble from buildings, but also that rubble itself is a form of building in its sheer accretive momentum, which is, you know, a paradox, that kind of paradox, which I'm not going to talk about Milton because no one wants to hear about that. But yes, I think there is something about production and making.
Yes. And we have a lot of facts these days.
These days?
I don't know. I mean, do we? Empirical.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Issue. Yeah.
Nice to think about the title as well. But it's interesting because it does. This is a very forced saying into talking about your own work, but it is kind of, emblematic of a certain kind of, I guess, symbolico-spatial imagination or logic, which maybe I feel like is also activated in your work, where this mound or place of wreckage is also, highly symbolic and almost ritualized space, you might say. And I just wonder if there's something that you find congenial or think there might be affinity between this kind of spatial imagination and the kind of spatial imagination that's at work in your respective poetries. You both like hotels, I noticed that. I like hotels too.
Can I jump in and say that as I was reading this, actually, Lucy, I was thinking, obviously, your collection as a whole, but of your preface and the way you're talking about the that space on the hill that you always walk past, that sort of, I think the phrase is something like has like all colonial sites, like a dull, sour kind of feeling. But then at the end, you talk really beautifully about it being a fenced off space, but the fence kind of bending as you move through it. And yeah, this made me sort of think of that, I guess, associatively because of the way in which you figured that space as, both closed but also permeable in certain ways. Like it provides a certain access as well.
Yeah, it's weird. It's I'm going to say something like a few things that are like really not answering the question.
Great.
Like,
That's what panels are for, Lucy.
So it's true, like that there is a kind of sense of. Sorry, is this close enough? By the way, the hill is a real hill. It was actually on a Hope Road. That was the name, and I lived in this bit of Perth, south of the river, that had been in the 1830s dairy farm. And so, actually, the street I lived on was called Homestead Avenue, and that original homestead's still there. It's like, because it's Perth, it's, I think, rendered now, and has like a few, maybe a jet ski or I don't know, something. But anyway, so there's the homestead, there's the rusty sheds on Hope Road, and then there's just this kind of wasteland, or like what I guess Locke called waste, and we still sort of use that word in a similar sort of way. And I don't know who it belonged to, but because the fence was there was a sense of stealing, which I loved. I love stealing, and it's, I guess, that's also the verb, to sort of steal, to sort of like come upon space in that sort of way. And for like personal reasons, like I had a very like weird and chaotic childhood, but that hill was sort of like this place of, to use a weird word, like sovereignty. Like I kind of would feel good there. I'd be stealing stuff, and I was talking. I'm so sorry to say the next bit to my analyst about various things, and he annoys me because he reads my work, and he was like, yeah, like it sort of sounds a bit like that, like feeling of, kind of like that power and whatever that you had on that hill. And I was like, what's crazy? It's exactly the same feeling I have when I'm with my friend Cameron, my best friend Cameron, whose last name is Hill. So actually, like this, I don't know if that's even anything, but I'd never thought about that before. But like also, it's like a hill is a person, which I hadn't realised before. I don't know, like maybe I just derailed.
No, I mean, that's one of the creepy things about the assertion of individuality of this, right? Which a wilderness, which to me is to itself single, and as you know, I think that's a really pertinent kind of resemblance to point to in the preface of the Open, the way in which public spaces or the commons actually promote a certain sense of privacy. Like there's a very poignant sense of privacy in public that only happens in parks, in these kinds of spaces, and that ambivalence between, or that kind of, the intertwinedness of privacy and publicness is something that I think is very kind of powerfully explored in the Open. Yeah.
And I think also to go back to the hotel thing, because the first part of the collection, Hotel Grand Saigon, because that's a return to another kind of site, right? In relation to colonial settlement, that's a return to the beginning or the centre of empire, in a way. And yeah, I guess the way that how is space, I guess, for you figured in a place like that? That's a very open question. You can ignore it.
That's a really hard question. I mean, the word space I feel like it's one of my least favourite words. Like, it's sort of, just because it can be, it's too hard. Like, it's actually too hard to...
Do you prefer place? There's a space-place debate. Is place a less
I prefer
uncomfortable?
Time.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that
Thanks.
actually...
Because we have a choice, right? Place. It's just,
I think that space is time, and that's actually what's going on, say, on here in this site, which I think we can locate. Like, we know where it is. I've driven past when it was like this. That's actually an assemblage of different time periods that are sort of like, and maybe that's what you are asking, Bella, in a way, is
that's exactly what it is.
like that it is in some way to measure time, to talk about space. And that's why some spaces feel fucked up. Because of things that have happened there, or that things that want to happen in certain places. Like, the road that I live on always floods, and I'm convinced it's because there must have been a creek there that maybe flew into towards the Merry, and it's just like, that's what this space or land maybe, I like that word. Yeah, like, land is a word, I think. And so there's like this desire of land, and it is a temporal thing. But that's just me. Like, I don't think that's right. Like, I think that there's probably something you could say, Bella, about space.
Yeah, tell us about chronotopes.
Yes.
Go back to your dissertation.
Well, please don't. I guess, I mean, this might skew the conversation in a different direction, but I think space, for me, chronotopes are time-space conglomerations, right? Like, you can't really separate one from the other. But say, take the hotel thing, as we both like hotels, and you like hotels, and you're in a very fancy one right now. So the hotel is, a very, very sort of typical chronotope, which is, do I need to explain?
Maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a theorist, Mikhail Bakhtin, who's not alive anymore, who came up with the theory of the
Bella
chronotope.
killed him.
I killed him in my thesis. No, he was this is an incredible thinker, Russian thinker, and he, in this reasonably short essay, actually came up with this concept of the chronotope, which is, a kind of a node of where I'm gonna botch this terribly, where time and space kind of solidify or concretize. And it's a way for him to create a bridge, a representational link between what he calls the real world and the world and space and time of literature. And he develops this in generally speaking, he's talking about genres of the novel. And so, he talks about the castle in the Gothic novel, and the hotel, I guess the hotel, I feel like he throws that in right at the end when he's talking about a bunch of them, and he doesn't necessarily talk about the particular genre that he's tying that to. But I suppose, the hotel is a kind of a no time and a no space, right? It's and the theorist Marc Augé talks about these things called non-places, which he locates very specifically in what he calls supermodernity, and highways, hotels, airports. motorways,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Where actually what is missing is a connection to what he calls place, but perhaps, Lucy, that a better way to say it is land, right? And all of the histories and associations that come with land are kind of absent from a space like, or a space-time like the hotel. What is this in relation to? I'm not entirely sure.
No,
Why is
we're
it
talking
attractive?
about space-time. But no, I mean, I think I was going to actually ask you, I'm glad you brought up the Gothic, because I was going to ask you about the way in which a genre like the Gothic and, you know, your use of genre tropes and narrative frames and ambience is about, you know, actually to go back to the words of the poem about succession, you know, the ways in which, you know, a kind of archetypal story like the fall of the House of Usher is about, you know, a house, you know, that metaphor itself is a kind of space-time sort of conglomeration, but about the suspension or the cessation or the kind of end of succession. And there's a kind of an interest in genealogy in your work. Like, that's one of the things about the Gothic that you seem to be quite interested in. That, especially, I can't remember the section in Theory of Colours where you talk about that it's almost like a detective story where this kind of character arrives in this environment and everyone in this town, there's a slightly kind of inbred atmosphere, like a eugenics type.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is that part of the attraction of Gothic?
Do you mean genealogies?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and you know, I guess we've started this with a reading of someone else's work, and I think we all are. Well, as most writers are avid readers, but I think sometimes I think materializing that genealogy for me is really interesting and important. I like having webs of connections that are made apparent between, you know, the work that I'm doing, but also the work that other writers have done over centuries, millennia. And that's what genres are, right? They're not, no single person, well, you can have, maybe arguably there are some people who've invented entire genres that nobody else has contributed to, but genres are, exist because there have been multiple contributions across, you know, multiple places and times. And so they're a collective creation, right? They're a collective category or body of literature, and you know, and so in that sense, I think, and that, you know, that's only in the obvious cases of obvious genres that we can identify: science fiction, horror, you know, fantasy. But this is happening, I think, in every text on every level. Being a writer, you're also necessarily a reader, and I think having those dialogues and conversations, kind of maybe more explicitly in text, is a nice kind of reminder of that embeddedness of all of us in the work that we're doing and the work that we're reading.
Yeah. I think that's something I really like about both your practices or work. Sorry, I hate practice is such a cliche, but in both the work, there's such a obvious kind of readerly, writerly circuit at work. Like, I get a sense of what kind of readers you are, what you're reading, what kind of which is another way to say that there is like a critical component embedded in that creative practice, I think, and I really appreciate that. But I guess this is, again, to kind of step back a bit, I guess I wanted to ask you about the impact or the influence of research on your sensibility, your kind of sense of history, or even just kind of the compositional methods you use, because you both have had periods where you have been in, you know, intense researchers, and there's a kind of, that comes to the fore in I think the work that you write and the work that you produce alongside the poetry as well. I get an immense sense of a knowledge about and interest in investment in, say, the history of the book as an object in your work, Bella, and, you know, Lucy, a lot of, you know, you've done so much work on photography as an artistic and an archival medium. So I wonder if that mindset or that kind of orientation towards the archive, like how that has left a kind of imprint, or maybe you sometimes feel it as a constraint.
I definitely feel academic writing to be a huge constraint. Like, it's I don't know why I do it. It's like the worst, like most hideous activity devised. And I guess the trouble is there are some things that can only be conveyed in that way. But I find it, I don't know, I don't think I always found it so difficult, but I have found it increasingly difficult to the point of impossibility. And so in some ways what was happening like syntactically, like on a very pragmatic level, I couldn't get to, like if you imagine a swimmer, like the Olympics are on, like, those swimmers that sometimes swim and they come from like a country that doesn't have a pool or whatever, and it's like they can't quite get to the end. It's like the sentence in certain types of formal or strict prose won't find its end. And there was this discharge or like excess or some some gross other thing that there's something else that wanted to be said, and I guess like to explain, because we're talking about poetry, I guess like it sort of seemed to be coming out in that sort of way, maybe not in the nicest poetry or like the most obvious like enjambed lineated lyric poetry, but I think it was still to do with an insufficiency or whatever. Like, no, a supersession of poetry to sequenced thought, I suppose, or linear thought, or coherent argument or something. Like, and I think that, for instance, we should be in praise of like begging the question, the circular argument, like maybe that's all we're ever really doing, which I think maybe that's another topic, but but yeah, that's part of it. The archive is another thing, which maybe I'll come back to, but like in terms of like the formal algorithmic kind of way of the prostration, like towards whatever the academic reader is, like that I guess has a direct role in like the way that I write.
And yet one thing I like is that sure there's maybe a constraint in that extensive approach in terms of modes of argument, syntax even, and yet there's another form of research, a more intensive form of research, that turns individual words into archives when you dive into etymologies and those accidents of language. You talk about, the word, how the word apocalypse, for instance, when you take apart, it's kind of, Greek roots means something, but actually it doesn't really have a direct resemblance to calypso. And yet, looked at from a certain distance, there is a kind of affinity between those two words. So there's something about a mode of researching or excavation that is alive to the kind of to happenstance or the aleatory that is freeing, despite the fact that there's another mode of research that isn't potentially, or maybe this is just a question of institutional forms, but it's not like a total rejection.
No, I think it's, you're right. It's like kind of like an insane way of paying incredible attention and sort of like trying to like hold all data points and still perform in that kind of way, but sort of do it badly, or that kind of thing. Like to sort of calypso, that's like that is resistance music, and it is sort of like in direct response to the apocalypse of the Caribbean space, so like I think it should they should be brought together, those two words.
I also wonder, because I think about the difference between sort of the methods and the product, right? So the product of academic work is as you say, sometimes very quite limiting and terrible in many ways. But the research, right? That process and that necessarily entails, as you're saying, James, the aleatory, the chance, the error. And we were talking about the selection of this poem, and I think you said at the beginning that you were just in the library and you grabbed it, and I think it's something that we all really enjoy, right? As researchers, as writers, as thinkers, is that is the element of contingency, of error that takes you in a different direction, that moves you away from that planned, dry academic course, or can change that course as well, right? And is really the necessary condition for anything creative.
Such a chef's kiss. Like, that's so good. Yeah, exactly. I think actually it's precisely the same methods, like all of the kind of probity or whatever, like the sort of like the care, but not suppressing happenstance, actually, because when you do academic work, there is a lot of like magic and chance. I mean, that's kind of, it is what happens, but you don't talk about the role of, I don't know, your sense of sarcasm, or like that it, like that a joke worked out, or that two books were sitting together on your table, that kind of thing. Yeah. But you can do that outside of, so yeah, I think that's really true. The method is actually quite sturdy across all of the modes.
Yeah, I think that chanciness is often, I think, offset by an environment or a particular writer's temperament, where there's almost extreme discipline and precision. So, I think about, a poet like Marianne Moore, which I realise that we all know and have some sort of affection for. Is that right, Lucy? Although was it you kept losing your Marianne Moore, or was it the bishop?
No,
the bishop. No, you're losing your bishop. Sorry. But also, Marianne Moore is a kind of, in terms of like syllabic materiality, obviously has some sort of influence on I think Lisa's poem. But that kind of very kind of extreme precision and kind of involvement and respect for fact and the empirical, and yet then that's what kind of provides the background against which these divergences or anomalies or errors. And I feel like that's the thing about, when you read that extract from The Crystal World, you're interested in the history of error. And in some sense, you could think of collage as deliberate error, the deliberate insertion of these kind of vagrant kind of circumambient things into the official narrative and breaking it apart and creating diffractions or curvings off, so to speak.
And isn't that what we enjoy? What I enjoy most in coming. I love, and actually this reminds me of a subject that maybe we all either taught or had some sense of. Tom Ford's, was it just poetry?
Poetry, Love and Death.
No, but I think he call it something else?
That's what it was called.
Oh, that's what it was called.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And for the record, I think originally it was Justin's.
Justin's, yes.
Well,
Tom Ford took it over in a guerrilla attack style
he
for
did,
one
he did,
semester, and I
that was
happened to teach it. But it was a course actually about reading poetry, which is exactly what we're doing here. And I think, and there's a number of sort of steps. It's actually quite great and easy to follow, even though
he has a book, How to Read a Poem,
How to Read
7
a Poem.
Steps.
And it's very thin, and you think it's going to be easy, but it's actually quite complex. But my favourite step in it is find the weirdness, and I think that's what I love when I'm reading, is that something stands out as just being weird or wrong, or like a half rhyme or an image that doesn't quite settle as it should. And those are the parts of what I'm reading or looking at that draw my interest, that I'm like, why did that happen? And I think being open to error and chance in the process of making, I think, allows for those that excess maybe to come out, and it's a bit ugly, but it's also sometimes the most enjoyable aspect of the work that's produced.
Yeah, it's like a weirdly methodical step in a method for reading poetry. It's sort of like that kind of aphoretic moment where it lets the air into the process, so to speak. Yeah. Do you remember, what are your memories of teaching that subject?
I'm still teaching it. But oh God. Can I say something else?
You can say whatever you want.
I'm sorry if anyone here has heard me say this before. It's like a really weird random quote. It's actually Nico, who worked with, this is I don't need to say this, but she was asked about what was it like to work with the Velvet Underground? How was that? And they, I guess, famously were awful to her. They didn't respect her. She was not included, and all of that sort of stuff. But she said that she loved it, and it was a really positive, it was a great experience because the Velvet Underground weren't afraid to make bad art. And I think in a way that's the role of when we have errors, or like when there's a sort of like a false friend or something in etymologically speaking, that's something to be feared in certain like formal institutional contexts, but then there are other places where you can be fearless, I suppose, with errors. That's in terms of the course, the subject. We're up to sound, so we're on the second step.
Okay.
Yeah, like read aloud. That's all really like that, and I think that's a step that we often forget. I think that all poetry can be read aloud, even what would be called visual or like concrete poetry. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of the sound quality, I suppose, that I think I feel when I read both your work, that there is always at the back of it a reply or an engagement with, what we might understand as the kind of conventional Western lyric voice or a certain intensity, but also a kind of a weirding of that at the same time through elision or through lowering the register. I mean, there is such a powerful, I think, and I think quite Australian kind of garrulity, that kind of loquaciousness in some of your work, Lucy. That's a way of critiquing that idea of what like a lyric poem should sound like. And so that, I mean, and part of it is also deployment of, I guess, the prosaic or prose. So both of you kind of have very interesting relationships to lineation, the look of the words on the page, and partially kind of evidenced by your sensitivity to the line breaks in Lisa's poem. So is that like a kind of, in what way do you position your writing in respect of that kind of archive of lyric poetry?
Hard
so
question.
Polite.
I'm not being polite, I'm being
Evasive.
self-serving.
I'll just like Bella really is the greatest like editor of poetry ever. Of
all time.
Ever.
Yeah.
Like Bella.
She actually has a belt
Pound.
that says greatest.
The goat.
Goat, yeah.
She asked a great question because she edited The Open. It was amazing to work. Like, it's one of the sort of best things that ever happened, honestly. The question is, why enjamb? Like, why does that line need to be broken? Why that? And that is the question. So I've had funny things said to me, like about that book. There's a lot of prose poetry, and there is a kind of like, people always create these like random hierarchies, and someone, I can't say who it was, but some like kind of like slightly Machiavellian person said to me, "Oh, Lucy, I think, The Open is really good. So what if it's prose poetry? I don't care what anyone says." That's what I fucking said.
Wow.
And it was fine. I thought it was great. But that is the question. The question is not why write prose poetry? Why write in prose? The question is why have like lineated poetry? Why and that is a very good question. And I have an answer, but I might ask like Bella
I
first.
want to hear the answer. You can't deflect that point.
Okay, so the factory, which was in the second word of the first line of the Gorton, is like, it's a site of production, and a particular sort of like, I guess a factory in the 20th century is like Fordist, like we have to pump out as much as possible. I don't know how, like I'm not overly invested in this idea, but like the enjambed line strikes me as sort of like a little bit of a factory, sort of, in that it kind of, it is an insertion of ambiguity. And so it's productive in that way. It sort of incites the reader to behave productively. Like, how many readings can you create of Andrew Marvell's The Garden, for instance? Like, that's like Eliot, to take the person who's responsible for the title of this, which I wasn't supposed to say. But, like, there's this notion in Western poetry that there is a sort of like goodness is in direct proportion to the potential for readings. How many interpretations can you create? Which I don't necessarily disagree with. I don't disagree with it that strongly, but I'm conscious of a priority being placed on productivism itself. And so the break asks the poem to make more with what it has. And I guess that's my answer. That's one of the answers, I guess.
Yeah. Also, I should say, I think on my reading, again, very kind of loosely, it is, I think, essentially a blank verse poem, but that stretches from lines anywhere from 5 to 14 syllables. But even the 14 syllable lines are essentially, I think, in pentameter. And so there is a kind of critique of that.
That's
sorry,
amazing.
someone laughed.
I love
That. Anyway, sorry.
Can I say though that there is something in, so the line break is a very, very obvious, like it's, shouting at you, this is a poem, this is a line break.
Yes, yeah.
And yet there are, when we talk about structure, it's not like poems that don't have line breaks don't have structure. And even poems that do have line breaks can have hidden structures, and I'm thinking very much, in the vein of Lisa's work, and someone you mentioned earlier, Marianne Moore, right? She's famous for her use of syllabics as a way of structuring. And syllabics, what I love about syllabics is that they're so idiosyncratic. They're so particular to her. She's like, I've decided that this line's going to have 7 syllables, and then the second stanza is going to mirror exactly the first stanza. But I'm going to hide that because unless you're the sort of reader who goes through and counts James.
I do. Religiously.
You did actually do your thesis on Marianne Moore, so I can't. I felt that. But that is a structure that is conditioning actually the way you read and the way you derive meaning from that poem or whatever it is you're reading. But it's happening at such a subliminal level that you're not aware. And so even when you're just working with prose, if you're going to create some sort of hierarchy there, that's just stupid. There are structuring devices at work. You are using actually prosodic elements like rhyme, like repetition, there's so much in the bag of tools of language that poets use, and the line break is just the most obvious one, and the most abused possibly, just by virtue of its like reproduction, perpetual reproduction. So yeah, I think that's possibly all I have to say on that.
I'm just going to stay with the question of structure for the moment, because I know that, in my conversation with you, you say, you go usually you go light on the line edits, but you are very big on structure, the kind of, so what are the cues there? So, you have rhyme, you have, various phonetic, semantic elements at the level of the image of poem, but when you look at a collection, what are you looking for in terms of a structure that kind of presents itself to you as an editor of poetry books? Maybe
I can speak about Lucy's, which I also I was saying yesterday, so that I didn't say it today, but I'm going to say it anyway, was that every time I read and this is from the very beginning when you first had the manuscript together, there was just something about it that was so moving, and and I can't even really articulate exactly what it is, but it's working at so many different levels, and one of them is very much your attention to language and the care that you're paying to every aspect of the work. But I think, when you first sent it in and we were having a dialogue about it, I think actually I'm pretty boring when it comes to structure. Because,
why are you so mean to my essay then?
Sorry,
Jesus.
yeah, just you.
Okay.
But I think what I like complexity on the line level, on the use of individual words, punctuation. But when you're looking at something as a whole, I like simplicity, in the sense that it's very difficult to find coherence, I think, when you have complexity on the line level. And so to balance that, for the reader, it's nice to have kind of quite simple containers for them to be able to place all of that complexity into, so that, some of the work is taken out of trying to figure out what is going on with a mass, and and all of the work can then go into figuring out what is happening at that line level, which is so significant for poetry and for poets. Which is not to say that you can't complexify a simple structure, but I think that's kind of the impetus. Yeah, and so I think, and I don't know if that's how it felt when we were having those dialogues.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I feel I don't have anything to add really. Like I just am like abject in my sort of admiration to do that. Like to be able to understand the whole, like that's a genius. Like that is incredible. Like I couldn't believe when this is just being very personal. When I think the first or second edits came back with those suggestions, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I was trying to do. You know, which sounds very cliched, but how does someone know that? Like that kind of like, I don't know. How did you know?
Well, it has to be not you, right? Like I think it's hard when it's you because you, as you say, you had that, but then. Yeah, I think you do need a bit of distance, right? And we're all editors as well, right? Like Lucy is also an amazing editor. You also edit. So I think we all know that there is what? There's just, I mean, I think you understand the mechanism of it when it's not you on the page.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because, I mean, it's interesting or surprising maybe to hear you say that, Lucy, because, you're an amazing critic and there is a holism to your understanding about certain books. So maybe, I don't know, like, do you think there's a difference between the kind of intelligence or sensitivity you need to have as an editor as opposed to that which we might ordinarily associate with a critic?
No.
No, you think, yeah.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's the same. So yeah, that makes sense that you did know. Yeah. I think it's all. Don't you? I mean, it's sort of they're all the same. It's sort of a way of reading, really. Ultimately, yeah. What do you think?
I once made this case and then I got like bollocked for it on social media. So I'm not
Oh,
gonna
really?
No. I mean, it's interesting because actually I've had this conversation with you, Bella, and you think there is a difference. You described, I think, from one of your messages, you're like, it's just the knack. That's how you described editing.
Really?
You said, I have a knack.
Did I?
Yeah. Which I thought was very presumptuous and slightly boastful, but but no, it was a way of, it was interesting because you didn't think of it as a cognitive or intellectual activity, editing. You thought of it as a very instinctive thing. And that's how you wanted to separate those two activities. And I wonder where that prejudice comes from.
Wait, well, separating out editing from what?
From criticism.
Oh.
Because I said that's basically what you do, and I kind of made Lucy's point to you, and you sort of disagreed.
Oh.
Maybe you were just disagreeing for the sake
Maybe I
of
was
disagreeing.
just, I
Yeah.
don't know, hallucinating or something at that point. Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I mean, doesn't criticism require more knowledge of the context as well, and certain traditions and histories of the work that you're criticising? Like, you can't sort of do criticism in a vacuum.
But isn't that the same for editing? Why is editing not exempt from that in a way?
Oh my God. Someone else.
Is it because it's not paid as well, or is it?
I mean,
yes, definitely.
think about your favourite critic. I don't know who it may be in a book over there, for instance, or so, often cited as people's favourite critics. Criticism is a form of magic, and it is intuitive, I think. Like sorry to just ruin your your trade, but I think it's quite instinctive, and like to sort of apprehend. This is why it's so hard. If you can't see it, it's sort of like you're really working with nothing, because you sort of somehow you just get the text and you can sort of like talk about it in some sort of way that may be useful to the reader. But it's that form of insight. The book is Walter Benjamin, by the way. It's just on the floor. James stole it from me because he also
You like
likes to
stealing,
steal.
so I was going to give you a taste of your own medicine. So, yeah.
Yeah, like there's the flash, or maybe I think if it's sort of like if it's a slog, that means there's something kind of wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
But then how do you hope to teach it? If it does, and I don't disagree with you, but that presents a pedagogical problem, right? How do you teach criticism if it is kind of magic?
I don't know. I mean, I don't teach criticism. I
Don't
teach
you?
something.
Poetry, Love and Death?
Poetry, Love and Death. Has anyone done that? Is anyone in this? Oh my God.
Oh, Jesus.
Yes. What is it? It's simply how to read. That's all that it is. Can you
Right.
read? Can you describe? And can you say a thought about what you just described? That's what that is.
Can I just say, I think we're about to run out of time, but can I just say, yes, I take your point. Yes, I mean, really, it is about being good readers in all cases. But is there something about the temporality? Editing is happening as the thing is being made. It's not solidified yet, right?
Yeah.
And so your interventions into it are about changing the course of what it could be, whereas criticism is definitely ex post facto, and the purpose is different, right? And maybe that directs your reading in a very different way.
Yes. I mean, I'd like to think that like one of the long-term impacts of criticism is it is actually that kind of editorial correspondence, but writ large over the course of a career rather than a particular work. I do think that's one of the kind of overlooked impacts, long-term impacts of criticism. It's funny, I really like, this is embarrassing, and this is a really awkward way of shoehorning it in, but like the kind of the relationship, the tension between magic and slogging and method, you know, finding the weirdness, but also having 7 steps that you can rely upon, you know. It's a really interesting tension. And I just remember thinking about it when I heard that new Tinashe song where she's like, you know, got to find someone who can match my freak, but you need someone with a good technique. And so if that is the takeaway from this whole panel, I just think about that the next time you hear nasty.
Yeah.
But we are out of time. Thank you to Lucy and Bella for your characteristic generosity. I hope that was enlightening, and I hope you check out Empirical. I do need to do the outro, sorry. Once again, this event is presented by Liminal in partnership with the Wheeler Centre and supported by the Sydney Review of Books. The Liminal Festival is supported by the Victorian Government through Creative Victoria, and both copies of Bella's 3 books and copies of The Open are available to purchase thanks to Amplify Bookstore. And if you see Bella and Lucy about, you are free to ask them very nicely to sign your books. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, James.